The mahogany conference table stretched like a battlefield between them, its polished surface reflecting the cold fluorescent lights of Harrison and Associates. Robert Harrison adjusted his Italian silk tie with practiced precision, the gesture automatic after 23 years of commanding this very room. His corner office occupied the 42nd floor of downtown Seattle's most prestigious legal tower, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay that whispered wealth to anyone who entered. Margaret Harrison sat across from him in a simple navy cardigan, her graying brown hair pulled back in the same modest ponytail she had worn for the past decade. Her hands rested quietly in her lap, fingers occasionally fidgeting with her plain gold wedding band. She looked small in the massive leather chair, dwarfed by the imposing legal atmosphere that Robert had carefully cultivated to intimidate opposing counsel. Whether you are watching from the bustling streets of New York or the quiet suburbs of Ohio, you have probably witnessed the uncomfortable tension that fills a room when someone is about to have their world completely redefined. Share in the comments where you are tuning in from, and if you have ever seen a situation where someone was dramatically underestimated. Robert's attorney, Marcus Caldwell, spread documents across the table with theatrical flair. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal gray suit crisp and expensive. This divorce would be nothing more than a formality, another routine dissolution to add to his impressive win record. He glanced at Margaret's representation with barely concealed amusement. Thomas Brennan looked nervous as he fumbled through a worn briefcase, searching for papers that seemed perpetually out of order. His rumpled brown suit suggested long hours and modest fees, a stark contrast to the polished efficiency surrounding Robert's side of the table. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the aggressive air conditioning that kept the executive floor at precisely 68 degrees. Robert leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never lost a significant battle. His steel gray eyes swept across Margaret with the same detached assessment he reserved for opposing witnesses he was about to destroy in cross-examination. At 51, he had maintained the commanding presence that made judges listen and juries believe. His thick silver hair was styled by the same barber who serviced the other partners in the firm, his hands manicured weekly at the club. Caldwell opened the preliminary settlement folder with ceremonial precision. The papers inside represented months of careful calculation, each figure designed to demonstrate Robert's overwhelming financial superiority while minimizing any potential claim Margaret might attempt to make. The numbers painted a picture of a woman who had contributed nothing measurable to the accumulation of wealth, a dependent who had lived comfortably on her husband's substantial earnings while raising their 2 children. The initial offer was strikingly modest. Temporary spousal support of $8,000 monthly for a period not to exceed 5 years. No claim to business assets, investment portfolios, or commercial properties. The family residence would be sold with proceeds split 60-40 in Robert's favor to account for his substantial down payment contributions. Personal property would be divided through negotiated agreement, with Robert retaining all items of significant value including art collections, wine cellar contents, and luxury vehicles. Robert's voice carried the measured authority that had served him well in courtrooms across the Pacific Northwest. He explained to Margaret that these terms reflected the realistic economics of their situation. She had chosen to remain a housewife and mother rather than develop marketable skills or contribute meaningfully to wealth creation. Her role had been important within its limited domestic sphere, but courts recognized the difference between emotional support and actual financial contribution. He detailed the properties and businesses with casual ownership. The downtown law firm employed 47 attorneys and generated gross revenues exceeding $12 million annually. Commercial real estate holdings included 3 office buildings in Seattle's financial district, 2 shopping centers in suburban developments, and a medical complex in Bellevue that housed 16 specialty practices. Investment accounts with Morgan Stanley contained diversified portfolios worth approximately $8.4 million. Margaret listened without interruption, her expression remaining neutral despite the growing catalog of assets from which she was being systematically excluded. Her financial contribution during their marriage had been negligible according to Robert's recitation. She had never held meaningful employment, never generated independent income, never invested personal resources in any business venture or property acquisition. Her signature appeared on routine banking documents as required by law, but substantive decisions had always remained his exclusive domain. The family vacation home in the San Juan Islands represented one of Robert's proudest accomplishments. He had negotiated the purchase during the height of his career success, transforming a modest cabin into a luxury retreat worth nearly $2 million. The property showcased his vision and business acumen, serving as testament to what focused ambition could achieve. Margaret had enjoyed the benefits of his success, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues and entertaining their children during summer vacations, but ownership had always been unquestionably his. Thomas shuffled through his disorganized papers, occasionally making notations on a legal pad that appeared to contain more doodles than relevant information. His questions seemed hesitant and poorly formulated, lacking the sharp focus that successful family law required. He asked about documentation timelines and verification procedures, mundane administrative details that suggested he was stalling rather than developing meaningful strategy. Margaret remained silent throughout the initial presentation, her composure almost serene despite the magnitude of financial reorganization being discussed around her. She had changed very little from the young woman Robert had married 26 years earlier, still preferring understated clothing and minimal makeup, still maintaining the gentle demeanor that had first attracted his attention in law school. Her transformation from promising student to devoted wife and mother represented choices she had made willingly, but those choices now carried economic consequences. Robert concluded the session with characteristic finality. This divorce would proceed smoothly and efficiently, without the dramatic complications that plagued less civilized dissolutions. Margaret would receive fair compensation for her domestic contributions, while he retained the assets his professional achievements had generated. The settlement reflected established legal principles and common-sense economics that any reasonable person could understand. As papers were gathered and briefcases closed, Robert felt the familiar satisfaction of a complex problem reduced to manageable components. His professional reputation, personal wealth, and social standing would emerge from this process entirely intact. Margaret would begin the next chapter of her life with sufficient resources to maintain comfortable independence while he continued building the legacy that would define his career. The elevator descended 42 floors in smooth silence, carrying them away from the battlefield where his victory had been secured with surgical precision. King County Superior Court buzzed with the kind of anticipatory energy that surrounded high-profile divorce proceedings. The polished marble floors reflected morning sunlight streaming through tall windows as attorneys, court staff, and curious observers filtered into Courtroom 3A. Judge Patricia Whitmore's chamber represented the pinnacle of family law jurisdiction in Seattle, where million-dollar settlements were decided with clinical precision. Robert Harrison entered the courtroom like a conquering general surveying his domain. His charcoal pinstripe suit was custom-tailored on Seville Row, the fabric falling in perfect lines that spoke of wealth accumulated over decades of legal victories. He nodded cordially to colleagues scattered throughout the gallery, men who controlled the city's most powerful law firms and understood that today's proceedings would reinforce the natural order of professional hierarchies. Margaret followed several steps behind, her presence almost apologetic as she made her way to the plaintiff's table. She wore a modest gray dress purchased years earlier from Nordstrom, conservative and unremarkable in every detail. Her leather handbag was worn at the corners, showing the kind of careful maintenance that suggested items were expected to last for many years rather than be replaced seasonally. The gallery filled steadily with faces that represented the different worlds Robert and Margaret had inhabited during their marriage. His colleagues occupied the front rows, partners from competing firms who had come to witness what promised to be a masterful demonstration of legal strategy. Their wives sat beside them in designer clothing, women who understood the social implications of divorce settlements and the importance of maintaining appearances during personal upheavals. Margaret's supporters clustered together in the middle section, creating a small island of suburban familiarity in the sea of legal sophistication. Her sister Janet clutched a tissue box, her eyes already red from anticipatory tears. Several neighbors from their Bellevue subdivision had taken time off work to provide moral support, their presence touching but ultimately powerless against the financial machinery now grinding into motion. Robert's girlfriend, Victoria Caldwell, chose a seat in the back corner where she could observe without drawing unwanted attention. At 34, she possessed the kind of polished beauty that expensive maintenance could achieve, her auburn hair styled in loose waves that caught the light perfectly. Her emerald silk blouse and black designer suit suggested someone accustomed to the finer things Robert could provide, though her presence in the courtroom carried implications that would become significant as proceedings developed. Judge Whitmore called the session to order with the brisk efficiency that had earned her reputation as one of the state's most respected family law jurists. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her black robes conveying the institutional authority that would ultimately determine how 26 years of marriage would be dissolved and redistributed. Marcus Caldwell rose to present his opening statement with theatrical confidence. His voice filled the courtroom as he painted Robert as the archetypal self-made success story, a man who had transformed modest beginnings into substantial wealth through talent, dedication, and strategic vision. The narrative was compelling in its simplicity, featuring a protagonist who had shouldered every meaningful responsibility while others enjoyed the fruits of his labor. Robert's testimony began with his professional autobiography, a carefully rehearsed recitation that highlighted his transformation from working-class origins to legal prominence. He had earned his law degree through evening classes while working full-time to support his young family, sacrificing personal comfort and social opportunities to build something substantial. Every property acquisition, every business expansion, every investment decision had required his direct involvement and ultimate approval. His voice carried easy authority as he detailed the scope of his business empire for the court record. Harrison and Associates employed 47 attorneys across 3 office locations, generating annual revenues that placed it among Seattle's top-tier legal practices. The firm specialized in corporate law and commercial litigation, serving clients whose combined assets exceeded $2 billion. His personal involvement in case strategy and client development had been essential to this success, requiring 60-hour work weeks and constant availability for crisis management. The property portfolio represented another dimension of his business acumen. Commercial real estate holdings included the Fort Etoisterie Columbia Tower office building, purchased during the recession when distressed pricing made expansion possible. 2 shopping centers in rapidly developing suburbs provided steady rental income from national chain retailers. A medical complex in Bellevue housed 16 specialty practices, generating substantial lease revenues while serving the growing technology sector's healthcare needs. Robert's description of Margaret's role during these years carried subtle condescension wrapped in superficial respect. She had chosen to focus on domestic responsibilities rather than develop marketable skills or contribute meaningfully to wealth creation. Her involvement in his business activities had been limited to occasional social functions, where she served as hostess for client entertainment. While her emotional support had been appreciated, courts recognized the distinction between personal encouragement and actual financial contribution. He recounted specific examples of Margaret's financial dependence with clinical precision. She had never held substantial employment during their marriage, never generated independent income streams, never invested personal resources in any business venture. Her credit cards were linked to accounts he funded, her spending monitored through monthly statements he reviewed personally. The family vehicles were registered in his name, insurance policies listed him as primary beneficiary, and investment accounts required his signature for any significant transactions. Thomas Brennan's cross-examination seemed tentative and poorly focused, lacking the sharp questioning that might have challenged Robert's narrative. His questions centered on procedural details rather than substantive financial matters, suggesting either inadequate preparation or fundamental misunderstanding of the case's complexity. He asked about documentation timelines and account verification procedures, administrative minutiae that failed to address the broader questions of asset ownership and contribution. Margaret sat quietly throughout Robert's testimony, taking careful notes in a leather-bound journal she had brought from home. Her handwriting was neat and precise, occasionally pausing to underline specific phrases or circle particular numbers. When Robert mentioned the San Juan Islands property address, she murmured a quiet correction that only Thomas heard, noting that the correct street number was 347 rather than 349. The detail seemed insignificant given the broader financial picture being presented. Caldwell presented documentation with ceremonial precision, each folder containing evidence of Robert's ownership and control over the marital estate. Corporate papers listed him as founding member and managing partner of Harrison and Associates. Bank statements showed his name as primary account holder for all business and investment accounts. Property deeds featured his signature prominently, with Margaret's name appearing only where legally required for spousal consent. The afternoon session continued with Robert's characterization of Margaret's spending patterns and lifestyle choices. She had enjoyed the benefits of his success without bearing corresponding responsibilities, hosting dinner parties for his colleagues while he worked late nights preparing cases. Her involvement in charitable organizations had been purely social, requiring no meaningful time commitment or financial risk. The comfortable lifestyle she had maintained depended entirely on his continued earning capacity and business success. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her back row seat as Robert detailed the extent of his wealth and property holdings. Her relationship with him had developed over the past 18 months, beginning as professional consultation about her own divorce and evolving into something more personal. The scope of his financial resources exceeded what she had previously understood, making her own substantial settlement from her first marriage seem modest by comparison. As the day's testimony concluded, Robert offered his most damaging assessment of Margaret's contributions to their shared wealth. She had been a capable wife and devoted mother within the limited scope of domestic responsibilities, but had never signed a single important document related to business operations or property acquisition. Her name appeared on routine banking forms as required by law, but substantive financial decisions had remained exclusively within his authority and expertise. Judge Whitmore adjourned the session with instructions for document production and testimony scheduling. The courtroom emptied slowly, conversations continuing in hushed tones as observers processed what they had witnessed. Robert accepted congratulations from colleagues with modest satisfaction, confident that the next phase of proceedings would continue establishing his complete control over the marital assets. Margaret gathered her notes carefully, placing the leather journal in her worn handbag with the same quiet precision she had displayed throughout the day's testimony. Her expression remained neutral despite the public humiliation she had endured, suggesting either resignation or something more complex that would become apparent as the case developed further. The second day of proceedings began with an unexpected transformation in courtroom dynamics. Thomas Brennan entered with a confidence that had been entirely absent during the previous session, his briefcase now organized with military precision and his rumpled appearance replaced by a pressed navy suit that suggested serious preparation had occurred overnight. His nervous fumbling had vanished, replaced by the focused intensity of an attorney who had discovered something significant. Judge Whitmore called the court to order as morning light filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. The gallery had filled again with the same collection of legal professionals and concerned family members, but the atmosphere carried a different energy today. Something had shifted in the careful choreography that had seemed so predictable just 24 hours earlier. Robert maintained his commanding presence at the defense table, though Marcus Caldwell appeared slightly less relaxed than his usual courtroom demeanor suggested. They had spent the previous evening reviewing documentation and strategy, confident that any surprises would be minor procedural matters easily handled by their superior legal expertise. Robert's Italian suit was impeccable as always, his silver hair perfectly styled, his steel-gray eyes surveying the courtroom with the territorial authority of a man accustomed to controlling every situation. Margaret sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in her lap with the same serene composure she had maintained throughout yesterday's humiliation. Her modest gray cardigan and simple black skirt suggested someone who had accepted her diminished circumstances with grace, though her leather journal lay open beside her with pages of notes written in her precise handwriting. She had arrived early and spent several minutes conferring quietly with Thomas, their conversation marked by her occasional nods and his increasingly animated gestures. Victoria remained in her back corner seat, today wearing a burgundy silk blouse that complemented her auburn hair beautifully. Her presence carried the subtle confidence of someone who had survived her own divorce proceedings successfully and understood the strategic elements that determined favorable outcomes. She watched Robert with admiring eyes, secure in the knowledge that his demonstrated wealth and legal skill would soon provide them both with the lifestyle they deserved. Thomas rose to address the court with an authority that surprised everyone present. "Your Honor," he began, "yesterday's testimony presented one version of the financial arrangements in this marriage, but the documentary evidence tells a significantly different story. I would like to present Exhibit A for the court's examination." His voice carried new strength as he approached the clerk's desk with a manila folder that appeared to contain substantial documentation. The first document emerged with theatrical precision, though Thomas's presentation lacked the rehearsed smoothness that characterized Marcus's style. The property deed for the Harrison family residence in Bellevue bore official stamps and notarial seals that testified to its authentic legal status. Robert's name appeared prominently in the ownership section, exactly as he had testified the previous day, but Margaret's signature occupied an equally prominent position as joint owner with full survivorship rights. Robert leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from casual confidence to focused attention. The deed represented standard marriage paperwork in his assessment, the kind of joint ownership that Washington state law required for primary residences. His testimony had acknowledged Margaret's legal presence on routine documents where spousal consent was necessary, but such technical requirements carried no implications about actual financial contribution or decision-making authority. Marcus whispered urgently in Robert's ear, both men reviewing the document with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were discovering details for the first time. The notarial date on Margaret's signature preceded Robert's by 3 days, an unusual sequence that warranted closer examination. Most married couples sign property documents simultaneously during closing procedures, making the temporal separation potentially significant for reasons that remained unclear. Thomas produced a second document with growing confidence, his earlier nervousness entirely replaced by prosecutorial focus. The property deed for the San Juan Islands vacation home carried the same official seals and legal formatting as the first, but this document told a more complex story about ownership and timing. Margaret's signature appeared as sole owner, with the property purchased 6 months before her marriage to Robert rather than during their subsequent years together. The courtroom atmosphere shifted perceptibly as observers processed the implications of premarital property ownership. Robert's testimony had characterized the vacation home as one of his proudest achievements, a luxury retreat that demonstrated his business success and strategic vision. The actual documentation suggested a fundamentally different narrative about who had provided the resources and made the acquisition decisions that created their shared lifestyle. Robert's composure cracked slightly for the first time in the proceedings, his steel gray eyes narrowing as he studied the documents with concentrated intensity. The vacation home purchase had occurred during their engagement period, when both were completing law school and living on student loans supplemented by part-time employment. His memory of those financial arrangements had become hazy over the intervening decades, but the documented evidence demanded immediate reconciliation with his sworn testimony. Margaret remained entirely calm throughout these revelations, her expression suggesting someone who was witnessing expected developments rather than shocking surprises. She made additional notes in her journal with the same precise handwriting, occasionally glancing toward Robert's table where heated whispered conferences were occurring between attorney and client. Her serenity contrasted sharply with the growing tension that was becoming visible in Robert's body language and facial expressions. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her back row seat, her designer clothing and perfect makeup seeming somehow less significant as questions emerged about the true sources of Robert's apparent wealth. The vacation home had been a central element in their relationship development, the setting for romantic weekends where Robert had described his property acquisition strategies and business philosophy. The revelation that Margaret held title challenged assumptions about his financial resources and decision-making authority. Thomas approached the bench with a third property deed, this one documenting the commercial building that housed Harrison and Associates' main offices. The Fortituostery Columbia Tower represented the crown jewel of Robert's business empire, according to his testimony, purchased during the recession when his strategic vision had recognized opportunity in market distress. The actual ownership documents revealed Margaret's signature as primary purchaser, with financing arrangements that predated Robert's involvement in the transaction. Judge Whitmore examined each document carefully, her experienced eye noting the authentic legal formatting and proper notarial procedures that verified their legitimate status. The chronology of signatures and purchase dates created a pattern that contradicted significant portions of yesterday's testimony, though the full implications remained to be explored through additional evidence and witness examination. Robert's legendary courtroom composure began showing strain as the documentary evidence accumulated. His whispered conferences with Marcus became more animated, their usual professional coordination replaced by urgent damage control discussions. The vacation home revelation was troubling enough, but commercial property ownership represented the foundation of his professional identity and wealth claims. Thomas returned to the plaintiff's table with visible satisfaction, his transformation from nervous ineffectiveness to prosecutorial confidence now complete. He organized additional folders with methodical precision, suggesting that today's revelations represented only the beginning of documentary surprises rather than their conclusion. Margaret observed his preparation with quiet approval, her journal notes continuing to accumulate in neat columns across multiple pages. The morning session concluded with Thomas addressing Judge Whitmore directly, his voice carrying the kind of controlled anticipation that suggested significant developments ahead. "Your Honor," he stated with newfound authority, "this is just the beginning of what the documentary evidence will reveal about the true financial arrangements in this marriage. The pattern that emerges from careful examination of property ownership, business incorporation, and funding sources presents a substantially different picture from yesterday's testimony." As court recessed for lunch, the gallery buzzed with excited conversations about the unexpected turn in proceedings. Robert's colleagues exchanged concerned glances, their earlier confidence in his inevitable victory replaced by uncertainty about what additional surprises might emerge. Margaret gathered her materials with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed throughout, her composure suggesting someone who understood exactly what would be revealed in the afternoon session. The afternoon session began with Thomas approaching the witness stand carrying a thick folder that seemed to contain substantially more documentation than anyone had anticipated. His transformation from bumbling incompetence to prosecutorial precision continued as he organized papers with methodical efficiency, each document positioned for maximum dramatic impact during presentation to the court. Robert returned from lunch recess with diminished confidence, his usual commanding presence replaced by watchful tension. Marcus sat beside him reviewing hastily gathered counter-documentation, their whispered conferences marked by increasingly urgent gestures and concerned expressions. The morning's property revelations had shattered their carefully constructed narrative, forcing desperate attempts to explain away inconvenient ownership details that contradicted sworn testimony. Judge Whitmore called the court to order as Thomas stepped forward with the first afternoon exhibit. "Your Honor, this document represents the original incorporation papers for Harrison and Associates, filed with Washington Secretary of State in March 1998. The pages bore official state seals and notarial stamps that verified their authentic legal status. But the ownership structure revealed information that would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the law firm's true origins. Margaret's name appeared prominently as founding member and primary shareholder, holding 60% ownership in the corporation that bore Robert's surname. Her signature occupied the president's line on incorporation documents, while Robert's name appeared as vice president with secondary authority over business operations. The filing date preceded Robert's bar admission by 4 months, suggesting that business planning and financial preparation had begun well before he was legally qualified to practice law. Robert's face flushed as he studied the incorporation papers with growing alarm. His memory of the firm's founding had focused on his role in client development and case management, responsibilities that had consumed his attention during the chaotic early years of business establishment. The financial and legal framework underlying those operations had been Margaret's domain, though the specific details of ownership structure had faded from his recollection over the intervening decades. Thomas produced bank statements from the firm's founding years, each page revealing Margaret as primary account holder with signature authority over all business transactions. The initial capitalization had come entirely from her personal resources, with substantial deposits that provided working capital for office lease, equipment purchase, and staff salaries during the months before revenue generation began. Robert's contributions appeared later and in smaller amounts, supplementing rather than funding the business operations. Marcus frantically shuffled through his own documentation, searching for contradictory evidence that might explain away the mounting revelations about business ownership and control. His usual courtroom confidence had evaporated entirely, replaced by the desperate concentration of an attorney who was discovering that his client's case had been built on fundamentally false assumptions about financial reality. The investment portfolio documents emerged next, revealing Margaret's personal holdings that had provided startup funding for multiple business ventures beyond the law firm itself. Her diversified assets included blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, and money market accounts worth approximately $3.7 million at the time of business incorporation. These resources had been systematically invested in Robert's professional development and business expansion over the following years. Robert attempted to explain that Margaret's financial contributions represented standard spousal support during his career development, common arrangements that many professional couples employed during early establishment periods. His voice carried defensive undertones that contrasted sharply with yesterday's authoritative testimony about his self-made success story. The documentary evidence suggested a pattern of dependence rather than the financial leadership he had claimed. Thomas approached the bench with academic transcripts and financial aid records that painted an entirely different picture of Robert's law school experience. Margaret had paid his tuition fees directly from personal accounts, covered his living expenses throughout 3 years of study, and provided the financial security that allowed him to focus exclusively on academic achievement. The bar examination fees, professional licensing costs, and initial practice setup had all been funded from her resources. Victoria watched these revelations with growing unease, her earlier confidence in Robert's wealth and status beginning to erode as evidence accumulated about his true financial position. She had been impressed by his descriptions of property ownership and business success, but the documentation suggested that these achievements belonged primarily to his wife rather than representing his personal accomplishments. Her position in the back corner of the courtroom suddenly felt more exposed than she had anticipated. The property management company documents represented perhaps the most shocking revelation of the afternoon session. Margaret held sole ownership of Harrison Property Management, the corporation that controlled all commercial real estate associated with Robert's business empire. The Columbia Tower office building, suburban shopping centers, and medical complex in Bellevue were all titled exclusively in her name, with rental income flowing directly to her personal accounts rather than joint holdings. Robert's attempts at explanation became increasingly desperate as each new document undermined his previous testimony about wealth creation and business ownership. He suggested that legal technicalities and tax strategies might account for the ownership structures, though his knowledge of specific details appeared limited and his responses lacked the precision expected from someone with his professional background. Marcus requested a brief recess to confer with his client, but Judge Whitmore indicated that proceedings would continue without interruption given the substantial documentation still awaiting presentation. The afternoon was advancing rapidly, and the court's schedule demanded efficient resolution of evidentiary matters before adjournment. Thomas organized his remaining exhibits with obvious satisfaction, each folder representing additional challenges to Robert's credibility. The commercial real estate holdings proved to be entirely in Margaret's name, purchased with her inherited wealth and personal investment decisions that had demonstrated remarkable financial acumen over the decades of their marriage. Robert's involvement had been limited to occupying office space and benefiting from rental income arrangements, but ownership and control had remained exclusively within her authority. Margaret maintained her serene composure throughout these revelations, occasionally making notes in her journal but showing no surprise at the documentary evidence being presented. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the growing agitation visible at the defense table, where Robert and Marcus engaged in increasingly heated whispered exchanges about strategy and damage control. Victoria began shifting her position subtly, moving from the front edge of her seat to a more withdrawn posture that suggested psychological as well as physical distancing from the proceedings. Her designer clothing and perfect makeup seemed somehow less significant as questions multiplied about Robert's actual financial resources and professional achievements. The romantic narrative about his business success was disintegrating under documentary evidence that revealed a fundamentally different reality. Judge Whitmore reviewed each exhibit carefully, her experienced eye noting the consistent pattern of Margaret's ownership and financial control across multiple business entities and property holdings. The scope of her wealth and decision-making authority far exceeded what anyone in the courtroom had anticipated, including apparently her own husband, who seemed genuinely shocked by the revelations about their financial arrangements. As the afternoon session drew toward conclusion, Thomas gathered his remaining exhibits with obvious preparation for additional devastating revelations. The pattern established by business ownership, property control, and investment authority suggested that Robert's entire professional identity had been built upon Margaret's financial foundation, though the full implications remained to be explored through continued testimony and documentary presentation. Judge Whitmore addressed Robert directly, her voice carrying the judicial authority that demanded complete honesty from all parties appearing before her court. "Mr. Harrison," she stated with measured precision, "these documents present significant discrepancies with your sworn testimony regarding property ownership and business control. Can you explain these inconsistencies to the court's satisfaction?" Thomas approached the witness stand carrying what appeared to be the final collection of documents, though their potential impact seemed to dwarf everything that had been revealed throughout the day's proceedings. His confidence had evolved from morning uncertainty to afternoon authority, and now radiated the focused intensity of an attorney who was about to deliver a finishing blow that would reshape everyone's understanding of reality. Robert sat rigidly at the defense table, his steel-gray eyes fixed on the approaching documentation with the kind of desperate attention reserved for life-or-death situations. His Italian suit remained impeccable, but perspiration had begun to appear along his hairline despite the courtroom's aggressive air conditioning. Marcus leaned close beside him, both men understanding that their carefully constructed defense was about to face its ultimate challenge. "Your Honor," Thomas began with theatrical precision, "these final exhibits will demonstrate the true scope of Margaret Harrison's financial genius and reveal the complete extent of her contributions to what has been mistakenly characterized as her husband's business empire." The first document bore the official seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, representing intellectual property registration that would fundamentally alter the court's understanding of professional achievement and ownership. The patent documentation revealed Margaret as the registered inventor of the legal case management software that had become Harrison and Associates' most profitable innovation. The technology streamlined client billing, document management, and courtroom scheduling in ways that had revolutionized legal practice throughout the Pacific Northwest. Robert had been credited publicly as the visionary behind this advancement, but the official federal records showed Margaret's name exclusively as creator and owner of the intellectual property. Robert's face drained of color as he studied the patent papers with growing horror. His memory of the software development process had focused on user interface discussions and feature requests, conversations that had occurred over dinner tables and weekend planning sessions throughout several years of collaborative work. The actual programming, system architecture, and patent application process had been Margaret's domain entirely, though he had somehow forgotten her central role in creating their firm's competitive advantage. Additional patent documents emerged revealing Margaret's ownership of 3 related software innovations that had been licensed to other law firms throughout Washington state. The licensing revenues generated substantial annual income that flowed directly to her personal accounts rather than joint holdings, creating another revenue stream that Robert had apparently been unaware of during his sworn testimony about family financial arrangements. Thomas produced trust fund documentation that revealed the true source of Margaret's substantial wealth. inherited assets that predated her marriage to Robert by more than a decade. Her grandfather's industrial fortune had been carefully preserved and expanded through conservative investment strategies that had transformed an initial $7 million inheritance into a current portfolio worth approximately $23 million. This wealth had provided the foundation for every business venture and property acquisition Robert had claimed as his personal achievement. The trust documents included annual statements showing systematic distributions that had funded Robert's law school education, bar examination fees, initial practice setup costs, and ongoing business expansion over the following decades. Margaret's role as trustee had given her complete discretion over resource allocation, allowing her to support Robert's career development while maintaining control over the underlying wealth that made such support possible. Marcus attempted to interrupt the proceedings with procedural objections, but Judge Whitmore indicated that all documentary evidence would be admitted and reviewed before any motions would be entertained. The scope and consistency of the revelations demanded complete presentation before the court could evaluate their implications for property division and spousal support determinations. The forensic accounting report represented the most comprehensive analysis of financial flows throughout the Harrison marriage, prepared by a certified public accountant whose expertise in complex divorce proceedings was widely recognized throughout the legal community. Every bank account, investment portfolio, and business transaction had been traced to its ultimate source, revealing patterns of dependency that contradicted Robert's testimony about self-made success and financial leadership. Robert's personal checking accounts had been funded exclusively through transfers from Margaret's investment income rather than his legal practice earnings. His credit card payments, mortgage contributions, and lifestyle expenses had been subsidized by her trust distributions throughout their entire marriage. Even his partnership buy-in at Harrison and Associates had been financed through Margaret's personal resources rather than his professional achievements. The forensic accountant's testimony via written affidavit explained that Robert had never generated sufficient income from legal practice to support the lifestyle he had maintained throughout their marriage. His annual earnings from client fees and partnership distributions had been supplemented by Margaret's trust income to the extent that his actual contribution to family finances represented less than 30% of total household resources. Robert's composure finally shattered completely as the full scope of his financial dependence became undeniable. His voice rose to an angry shout as he accused Margaret of deliberately concealing financial information and manipulating documentation to create false impressions about their economic arrangements. His accusations echoed through the courtroom with the desperation of a man whose entire identity was collapsing in real time. Marcus attempted to calm his client while simultaneously examining options for case withdrawal, recognizing that continued representation might compromise his professional reputation if Robert's behavior became more erratic. The documentary evidence had created an impossible situation where vigorous advocacy would require challenging authentically documented facts that appeared to be entirely legitimate and verifiable. Victoria rose quietly from her back corner seat and walked toward the courtroom exit with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. Her designer clothing and perfect makeup could not disguise the fact that her relationship with Robert had been based on assumptions about his wealth and status that had proved to be completely unfounded. The door closed behind her with soft finality that marked the end of more than just her presence in the proceedings. Margaret spoke for the first time during the entire divorce proceedings, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded immediate attention from everyone present. "Your Honor," she began with calm precision, "my business philosophy has always emphasized long-term wealth preservation and strategic investment rather than conspicuous consumption or public recognition. I have preferred to work behind the scenes while allowing my husband to enjoy the social benefits of apparent success." Her explanation continued with the kind of financial sophistication that demonstrated deep understanding of complex economic principles and investment strategies. The trust fund management, business development, and property acquisitions had been coordinated through careful planning that maximized tax advantages while protecting assets from potential creditor claims or professional liability issues that might affect Robert's legal practice. Judge Whitmore listened with growing amazement as Margaret detailed the scope of her financial empire and the systematic support she had provided for Robert's career development over more than 2 decades of marriage. Her knowledge of specific transactions, timing considerations, and strategic objectives revealed a level of business acumen that exceeded what most professional investors achieved throughout entire careers. The revelation that Robert had been essentially an employee in his own law firm became clear as Margaret explained the actual ownership structure and profit distribution arrangements. His partnership title had been largely ceremonial, designed to maintain his professional dignity while ensuring that business control remained with the person who had provided the capital and strategic direction necessary for success. As the afternoon's testimony concluded, Thomas addressed Judge Whitmore with a request that carried particular satisfaction given the day's revelations. "Your Honor," he stated with measured authority, "given the extent of Mr. Harrison's financial dependence on my client's resources, we request that he be required to pay all legal fees and court costs associated with these proceedings from his own independent resources, if any such resources can be identified and verified to exist." The courtroom fell silent as the full implications of the day's evidence settled over everyone present. Robert's legendary legal reputation, impressive business empire, and accumulated wealth had been revealed as elaborate constructions built entirely upon Margaret's financial foundation and strategic vision, leaving him with virtually nothing that could be legitimately claimed as independent achievement or ownership. Judge Patricia Whitmore studied the accumulated evidence with the methodical precision that had earned her reputation as one of Washington State's most respected family law jurists. The documentation spread across her bench represented one of the most comprehensive reversals of assumed financial reality she had encountered in 30 years of divorce proceedings. Her decision would carry implications that extended far beyond the immediate parties, establishing precedent about hidden wealth, financial contribution, and the dangerous assumptions that could destroy lives and careers. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Whitmore prepared to deliver her ruling, understanding that the next few minutes would determine how 26 years of marriage would be dissolved and redistributed. Robert sat motionless at the defense table, his earlier bravado completely extinguished by the overwhelming evidence of his financial dependence and professional irrelevance. Marcus had withdrawn from the case during the lunch recess, citing irreconcilable differences with his client about legal strategy and factual representation. Your Honor's voice carried the institutional authority that transformed personal disputes into legal precedent, each word carefully chosen to reflect both the specific circumstances of this case and the broader principles of equitable distribution that govern marital dissolution in Washington State. The evidence presented during these proceedings has revealed a pattern of financial ownership and business control that differs substantially from the initial representations made to this court. Margaret Harrison shall be awarded sole and complete ownership of all marital assets, including but not limited to Harrison and Associates law firm, all commercial real estate holdings, investment portfolios, intellectual property rights, and the family residence in Bellevue. These assets rightfully belong to Mrs. Harrison based on documented evidence of her exclusive financial contributions, business ownership, and strategic development over the duration of the marriage. The judge's voice continued with measured authority as she addressed the question of spousal support that had seemed so straightforward during Robert's initial testimony. Given Mr. Harrison's demonstrated financial dependence on his wife's resources throughout their marriage, this court awards him temporary spousal support in the amount of $2,000 monthly for a period not to exceed 18 months, sufficient time for him to establish independent housing arrangements and seek appropriate employment within his professional capabilities. Robert's face reflected the devastating comprehension of someone whose entire world had collapsed in the span of 3 days. The monthly support amount represented less than his typical dinner expenses during the marriage, a symbolic acknowledgement of his actual financial position rather than meaningful assistance for maintaining his previous lifestyle. The 18-month limitation ensured that his period of dependency would end definitively, forcing genuine independence for perhaps the first time in his adult life. Furthermore, Judge Whitmore continued, Mr. Harrison shall vacate all properties currently under Mrs. Harrison's ownership within 30 days of this ruling. This includes the family residence, vacation home, and any office space or business facilities associated with Harrison and Associates. Mrs. Harrison shall have complete discretion regarding Mr. Harrison's continued employment or partnership status within the law firm that bears his surname but belongs entirely to her. The gallery buzzed with quiet conversations as legal professionals processed the implications of such a comprehensive asset transfer and the precedent it might establish for future cases involving concealed wealth and misrepresented financial contributions. Robert's colleagues exchanged concerned glances, understanding that their assumptions about professional success and wealth accumulation had been fundamentally challenged by the day's revelations. Margaret rose gracefully as Judge Whitmore concluded the formal proceedings, her transformation from dismissed housewife to revealed financial genius now complete in the eyes of everyone present. She thanked Thomas for his representation with quiet dignity, though both understood that her careful preparation and strategic documentation had been the true foundation of their courtroom success. The leather journal that had seemed so insignificant during Robert's testimony had contained detailed records of every financial transaction and business decision throughout their marriage. News of the Harrison divorce settlement spread through Seattle's legal community with a velocity reserved for the most shocking professional scandals. Partners at competing firms called emergency meetings to review their own knowledge of colleagues' financial arrangements, suddenly aware that apparent success might conceal dangerous assumptions about wealth ownership and business control. The story became required reading for family law attorneys seeking to understand how completely conventional wisdom about marital finances could be overturned by careful documentation. Robert's departure from the courtroom marked the beginning of his rapid descent from legal prominence to professional irrelevance. The 42nd floor corner office that had symbolized his success was emptied within a week, his personal belongings fitting easily into boxes that emphasized how little he had actually owned despite decades of apparent wealth. The view of Elliott Bay that had once represented his territorial authority now belonged entirely to Margaret, along with every other symbol of power and achievement he had claimed. Victoria's abandonment became complete when she learned the true extent of Robert's financial dependence and the minimal spousal support that represented his only income source. Their relationship had been built upon assumptions about his wealth and status that proved to be entirely fictional, leaving her with no reason to continue an association that offered neither financial security nor social advancement. Her own substantial divorce settlement suddenly seemed wise and necessary preparation for the uncertainty that surrounded relationships with apparently successful men. Margaret's assumption of control over Harrison and Associates created immediate challenges that required delicate handling of both staff relationships and client expectations. The firm's 47 attorneys had known her only as Robert's quiet wife, making her transition to active leadership a complex process of establishing authority while maintaining business stability. Her first staff meeting revealed the depth of her knowledge about case strategies, client relationships, and operational details that surprised even senior partners who had worked with Robert for decades. The staff's initial shock gradually transformed into grudging respect as Margaret demonstrated comprehensive understanding of legal practice management and strategic business development. Her questions during case review sessions revealed insights that had been missing from Robert's more superficial involvement, suggesting that her behind-the-scenes contributions had been more substantial than anyone had realized. The firm's financial performance actually improved under her direct leadership, freed from Robert's expensive lifestyle demands and questionable strategic decisions. Robert's search for alternative employment proved more difficult than his professional reputation had suggested it would be. The scandal surrounding his divorce proceedings had damaged his credibility within Seattle's legal community, while the revelation of his financial dependence raised questions about his actual contributions to previous successes. Firms that had once courted his partnership interest now viewed him as a potential liability whose apparent achievements belonged to someone else entirely. His eventual position as a junior associate at a modest family law practice represented a devastating decline from his previous status as managing partner of one of Seattle's most prestigious firms. The salary barely covered basic living expenses, forcing him to rent a studio apartment in a suburban development that lacked the luxury amenities he had considered essential throughout his marriage. His new colleagues treated him with polite professional courtesy that carefully avoided acknowledging his previous prominence. Margaret's transformation extended beyond business leadership to encompass the social circles where she had previously been marginalized as Robert's unremarkable wife. Her revealed wealth and business acumen made her a sought-after presence at charitable events and professional gatherings, though she maintained the modest demeanor that had characterized her throughout the marriage. Her generous contributions to legal education and women's professional development programs established her as a significant force in the community's philanthropic landscape. The children's adjustment to their parents' dramatically altered circumstances required careful navigation of changed family dynamics and social expectations. Margaret's settlement terms ensured their continued access to private education and extracurricular opportunities, while Robert's reduced means limited his ability to provide comparable experiences during visitation periods. The contrast emphasized the extent to which their previous lifestyle had depended entirely on Margaret's financial resources rather than Robert's legal career. Whether you are someone who has ever felt underestimated in your own life, or you have witnessed the dramatic moment when someone's true capabilities were finally revealed, this story resonates with the universal experience of hidden strength and delayed justice. Share your thoughts in the comments about times when you have seen people dramatically underestimate someone who turned out to be far more capable and powerful than anyone realized. 6 months after the divorce settlement, Margaret occupied the corner office that had once represented Robert's professional domain. The floor-to-ceiling windows now framing her view of Elliott Bay and the expanding business empire that had always been hers to control. The mahogany desk that had witnessed his confident dismissal of her contributions now served as the command center for strategic decisions that continued building wealth and influence throughout the region. Harrison and Associates thrived under Margaret's acknowledged leadership, attracting new clients who were impressed by her combination of legal insight and business sophistication. The firm's reputation evolved from Robert's courtroom theatrics to Margaret's strategic excellence, establishing a foundation for continued growth that had been impossible under his more limited vision. Her name appeared prominently on letterhead and professional listings, finally receiving the public recognition that her contributions had always deserved. Robert's current position afforded him occasional glimpses of Margaret's continued success through legal community publications and professional announcements. Her expansion into commercial real estate law and intellectual property protection had created new revenue streams that demonstrated the business acumen he had never fully understood or appreciated. The software innovations she had developed continued generating licensing income that funded additional business ventures and charitable initiatives. The Harrison divorce became a cautionary tale within legal circles about the dangers of assuming that apparent success reflected actual contribution and ownership. Law schools began incorporating the case into ethics courses about professional responsibility and the importance of understanding true financial arrangements in client relationships. Margaret's strategic documentation and patient preparation became models for protecting interests that might otherwise be vulnerable to misrepresentation. As evening light reflected off the polished surfaces of her corner office, Margaret reviewed financial reports that documented continued growth across all business sectors under her direct control. The empire that Robert had claimed to build through his own vision and effort had flourished beyond his limited imagination once freed from his ineffective leadership and expensive lifestyle demands. Her quiet satisfaction reflected not vindictiveness toward his current circumstances, but rather the deep contentment that came from finally receiving proper recognition for decades of hidden contribution. The leather journal that had seemed so insignificant during those first courtroom proceedings now resided in her desk drawer as a reminder that careful preparation and patient documentation could overcome even the most arrogant assumptions about power and worth. Margaret had always known her true value, but the legal system's formal recognition had provided validation that extended far beyond personal satisfaction to establish principles about hidden contributions and delayed justice. Robert's story served as a permanent reminder that underestimating others based on superficial appearances could lead to devastating consequences when reality was finally revealed and documented. His comfortable assumptions about Margaret's limitations and his own superiority had blinded him to the true source of his apparent success, creating vulnerabilities that patient preparation had exploited with surgical precision. The quiet woman in the modest cardigan had proven to be the financial genius behind everything he had claimed to achieve, transforming from dismissed wife to revealed empress of an empire that had always been hers to command.